Welcome to Storyflix. In this video, we will discuss a thriller about a widow who lost her daughter on a flight from Berlin to New York City. But how could a girl disappear at 37,000 feet? Let's solve this riddle in the Flightplan. Flightplan begins with a scene where Kyle, a young woman who has just lost her husband. Kyle still can't believe that her husband has to leave her and her only daughter, Julia, who is only 6 years old. Julia, Kyle's daughter, is a beautiful girl but is unstable after she lost her father. Kyle finally decided to return to America with his husband's body. That night in her room, Kyle was putting Julia to sleep. When she was about to close the window, she could see two men staring at her room from the opposite apartment. Julia, who woke up, called her, but when Kyle looked back at the opposite apartment, the two men were not there. Kyle then decided to take some sleeping pills and fell asleep. The next day, Kyle and Julia are ready to leave for the airport. But Julia was still so scared. She even asked to hide under her mother's coat when she got into the taxi. Arrived at the airport, the ambience was so crowded with many travelers. While watching the flight schedule, Kyle suddenly realized that Julia wasn't there. Among the people passing by at the airport, she lost her only daughter. Luckily, her eyes caught sight of Julia in a candy shop alone. Kyle, who was panicking, didn't even realize she was so angry with Julia, who left without telling her. While waiting for the plane, Julia was amazed to see the plane's massive size. Kyle explained that the aircraft was an E-474, the latest type. No wonder Kyle knows a lot about airplanes, because she worked as an engineer at an aircraft development company in Berlin. Julia also asked that she could hold her boarding pass, and Kyle allowed it. Due to bringing children, Kyle and Julia were allowed to board the plane first. On the plane, Julia sat by the window. Then when the other passengers started to get on the plane, Julia dropped her toy plane, so she crouched down and picked it up. It made some passengers unaware that Julia was there. All passengers started popping up inside the plane and took their seats. Near Kyle, a guy named Carson says there are a few empty seats in the back. He suggested if Kyle wanted a quieter atmosphere in flight, maybe she could move there. Carson also looks like he likes to flirt with one of the flight attendants. A flight attendant named Stephanie started counting the number of passengers using a counter. Looking out the window, Julia could see a car carrying her father's coffin. Her mother hugged her tightly, trying to calm her daughter down. Julia then blew out the airplane window with her breath and drew a heart, showing her love for her late father. The plane finally took off. All passengers seemed to enjoy their journey. Kyle then offers Julia to move and sit in the empty back seat so they can relax more. Unknowingly, they both fell asleep on the way on the plane. Kyle, who had been asleep for several hours, woke up to find her daughter's seat empty. She then came forward and checked on their previous seats, but Julia wasn't there either. Kyle asked Carson if he saw his daughter. Unfortunately, Carson didn't. Kyle also thought that her daughter must be wandering around looking for new friends, so she decided to look for it. But after checking in the toilet, the lounge, even asked a flight attendant named Fiona, Kyle couldn't find Julia. Kyle is now starting to panic because she can't find her daughter anywhere. Finally, she decided to go back to her seat, and there she found Julia's teddy bear. Julia never leaves her teddy bear. So where exactly is she? Stephanie helps Kyle announce the loss of a child and asks if anyone sees Julia to report it immediately. But after some time passed, no one reported seeing Julia. Kyle started to panic. She knew that her daughter had suddenly disappeared and she had to find her as soon as possible. Stephanie gets a call, and when she hangs up, she said she wasn't sure they would find Julia on the plane because Julia was never registered on this plane. According to Stephanie, the seat that was supposed to be occupied by Julia was listed as empty. But how is that possible? Kyle tried to explain if she was sure she had Julia on the plane. But neither Stephanie nor Fiona is sure to see Kyle enter with her daughter. Kyle also cannot show Julia's boarding pass. Kyle immediately ran to the overhead compartment above her seat, and how surprised she was when she found Julia's bag was not there. A child as small as Julia couldn't possibly open the compartment and retrieve her bag. Obviously, someone kidnapped her daughter. Kyle can't stay silent, knowing her daughter has been abducted. Immediately she ran to the cockpit and tried to talk to the pilot. But she is stopped by Carson, who turns out to be a sky marshal. Kyle finally met with Captain Rich. But at that time, Kyle couldn't prove that she brought Julia because no one saw her get on the plane, neither the flight attendants nor Carson, who was sitting next to her. Kyle can't even show Julia's boarding pass. Kyle began to be interrogated whether she had drunk alcohol, but Kyle said she only took some sleeping pills. Everyone started to doubt Kyle and thought she was just imagining taking Julia with her on the plane. Was Kyle so depressed that she thought she'd brought Julia with her to America? A panicked Kyle tries to pressure Captain Rich into sending the entire crew looking for her daughter. Finally, Captain Rich agreed. All the lights were turned on, and everyone was forbidden to move from their seats. All flight crew is now starting to look for Julia in all plane corners, including toilets, luggage, even down to the plane's engine. Stephanie then checked the engine on the front of the plane, but she couldn't find any sign of Julia. Kyle, accompanied by Carson, tried to search among the passengers until she finally stopped when she saw two Arab men. Kyle was sure she had seen the two men. It turned out that she saw them last night when they were staring at Julia's room from across her apartment. Kyle was so panicked and started asking the two men to return her daughter, but the two Arab men kept evading and convinced they had stayed at the Hilton last night. Kyle couldn't hold herself back anymore and attacked the two men. A commotion broke out and created chaos. Many passengers also began to suspect the two men because of their Arabic looks. Carson finally got Kyle out of the way before she messed things up even more. Kyle believes Julia was kidnapped because someone wanted to hijack this plane, especially since she knows the ins and outs of planes. That must be the reason why she was chosen. But it turns out that Captain Rich has allowed the passengers to get out of their seats, making Kyle so angry. Captain Rich finally explained that Julia had never been on this plane because she had died. It turns out that her husband brought Julia down and killed both of them. That's what the head of the funeral home said. Captain Rich's words made Kyle confused and tossed between reality and her imagination. Kyle, who was confused, then ran, not wanting to give up looking for her daughter, but instead, she was knocked unconscious by one of the Arab men. Consciousness left her. Kyle wakes up handcuffed. A psychologist tried to calm her down. Between the grief of her husband, who died suddenly falling from her apartment, and now her missing daughter, Kyle feels devastated and confused by everything that happened. Felt like she was going crazy. And that's when Kyle looked out the window and realized one thing: she could see the heart that Julia made with the breath from her mouth. She realized that Julia had really been kidnapped. She had to find Julia. Kyle pretended she wanted to go to the bathroom to be alone, but in the bathroom, she just slipped through the crack in the ceiling and ran away. Knowing the ins and outs of the plane, Kyle made a mess on the plane. By changing a few plugs among hundreds of wires, the plane goes awry. The oxygen masks fell, and the plane's lights suddenly went out, making all the passengers on the plane panic. In the midst of people's panic, Kyle sneaked into the engine room of the plane. Kyle looked for Julia everywhere, and she even destroyed a car, but Julia wasn't there. When Kyle found her husband's coffin and opened it, she panicked that her daughter would be in the coffin as Captain Rich had alleged. But Julia was not found there. That's when Carson came in and pointed a gun at Kyle. Carson can't let Kyle run around and mess up this flight anymore because the safety of all passengers is at stake. But Kyle believes her daughter was kidnapped. If her daughter had died, as everyone said, she would have found two coffins there. After pleading with Carson finally decided to talk to the pilot to help Kyle. But no one guessed what Carson would do before speaking to the pilot. Turns out she went down into the engine room and into Kyle's husband's coffin. Inside the coffin, Carson hides bombs, and he has the detonator. Carson then headed towards the front of the plane and started setting some bombs. There Julia was fast asleep, not understanding what was going on. Carson finally told Captain Rich that Kyle was hijacking the plane and demanded a ransom of $50 million be transferred to an account. If the plane refuses, then Kyle will blow up the plane. Carson said Kyle asked Captain Rich to land the plane and let all passengers and crew off the plane. Kyle also asks for a G3, a small plane full of gas. After finishing talking to the pilot, Carson met with Stephanie, who turned out to be his accomplice. But Stephanie looks panicked and doubtful about all their plans. Carson also assured that he had calculated everything. Moreover, Kyle thinks the two Arabs kidnapped her daughter, then they'll both be able to get away with the money unnoticed. Finally, Captain Rich said they had transferred the money and that all of Carson's plans were going according to his expectations. Instead, Carson tells Kyle that they will land the plane soon and let her search for her daughter. Everyone will even be interrogated. Hearing this, Kyle was so relieved that she would definitely find Julia. Finally, the plane made an emergency landing at an airport. All the passengers started to get off the plane and leave Kyle and Carson in the backseat. Now it's the crew's turn to go down. When she saw Captain Rich, Kyle immediately ran towards him. Of course, Carson is trying to stop her, but Kyle is already talking to Captain Rich, still hoping to find her daughter. That's when Captain Rich asks Kyle to stop pretending to look for her missing daughter because the money has been transferred and the G3 plane has been prepared for her to escape. His statement took Kyle by surprise, and that's when Carson decided to leave. He knew that all his secrets have been exposed. But just as Carson was about to take his foot off the last step, Kyle shouted his name and begged him to come back. Now Kyle knows that this is all a trap and she's not going to let Carson just walk away. Carson returns to the plane and threatens if Kyle tells everyone, he will suppress the detonator and kill Julia at the same time. Carson and Kyle finally re-enter the plane while the pilot and crew leave the plane. The airplane door closed. Before Carson could turn around, Kyle swiftly beat him with a fire extinguisher. Carson fell to the ground. Kyle quickly handcuffs Carson's hands and grabs the detonator. But Carson is not easy to knock out. He hid a gun in his socks and tried to shoot Kyle, who now dodged away. The chase scene was unavoidable until Kyle hid in the cockpit. That's where Carson begins to reveal that Kyle's husband didn't fall from the building, but he was killed by Carson. They need a coffin to carry the bomb, and obviously, Kyle is the perfect target because she knows the ins and outs of planes and could easily be accused of being a terrorist. Carson continues to block Kyle's exit until Kyle outwits him by throwing a folder at the plane's ceiling. The duped Carson immediately left, and Kyle knew it was the right time for her to get out of the cockpit. Kyle tries to find Julia, but she is blocked by Stephanie, who looks nervous. But Stephanie could not do anything and was beaten by Kyle. Stephanie decides to run away because she feels Carson's plans have fallen apart. Kyle went down to the engine room and didn't expect to find Julia, who was still sleeping. That's when Kyle realized the 2 bombs Carson had placed there. Kyle immediately picked up Julia and carried her through a small gap. A staggering Carson tries to get Kyle and Julia, but he can't find them. Meanwhile, Kyle, who knew well about the plane's condition, slipped Julia and herself through a small door. With a single tap on her detonator, Kyle managed to ignite 2 bombs and kill Carson. Kyle finally managed to get her daughter out of the doom on that plane. Everyone who witnessed it was surprised that Kyle wasn't hallucinating about losing Julia, a mother who fought for everything to get her daughter back. Stephanie was finally arrested. Now Kyle and Julia can go home peacefully back to America.